Okay, so there has been, and maybe it's a question of waves and a pendulum swing about how we feel about the past, and there are nativist responses that are also sometimes not particularly helpful in responding to the residue, as it were, of the colonial period. I do want to, because we have about 50 minutes, so I'm just, it's kind of racing through it, but I'm trying to pick up on some of the things that you have contributed to in thinking about the economy that's in the public sphere, right? And I grew up reading Aliran, and earlier this, in the festival we talked about the trajectory of Aliran, but developmentalism, the critique of it. I know you're heavily involved in the discussions about industrial policy, the need for it, and more recently you floated, I mean, you put out in the public sphere the idea of premature deindustrialization, something, so you're kind of helping shape the economic discourse. What is it that underscores that? What is it that you are trying to get us to think about when you raise these issues?
When I left the country about 15 years ago, it was under circumstances where, in a sense, I was, Prime Minister Mahathir had stepped down. In a sense, the critiques had all been made about the system, and it seemed to be, there was very little choice, and I was also having a difficult time in my place of employment, and so I had very little choice but to leave at that time. And now, I had the opportunity, which I treasure a lot, of working for 11 years in the UN system. And basically I had to struggle with the fact that the UN was being slowly taken over by, not so much necessarily by individuals, but by new modes of thought, which had not really addressed many of the problems of the past. And I was beginning to see a number of problems. So, we responded to many of these problems in many different ways, most of which, premature deindustrialization is one phenomena which we talked about, but many other things as well. And to be quite honest, I had written about premature deindustrialization well before I went to the UN. But one thing which I'm terribly proud of, if I can brag a little bit, is coining the term Global Green New Deal. And thanks to AOC, Alexandria Octavia Cortez, she has brought at least the Green New Deal part of it back with a vengeance. So it's captured the imagination of a whole lot of people all over the world. But coming specifically as far as this country is concerned, the fundamental issue, of course, is the fact that we are a country which has had, for worse, I would say, for about nine decades, our social and political discourse has been dominated by varieties of ethnopopulism, including what you refer to as nativism. And this ethnopopulism is of various types, and there's no single ethnopopulist discourse. And I would argue that the ethnopopulism, or ethno-nationalism as sometimes they refer to it in the West, is actually something which has been learned from the colonies. So if you look at the problems in Sri Lanka, if you look at the problems of many other post-colonial societies, including where tribal discourses are actively promoted for political advantage and also for divide and rule in the contemporary period. So for me, a lot of these things are very important. But one of the things which I did appreciate about the first Mahathir regime was the fact that he put industrialization and nationally led industrialization on the agenda, as it had not been before that. Because the early industrialization, the 1970s, was basically sort of, getting the foreigners to come and invest in Bayan Baru and, that kind of thing. And this, I think, was extremely important. It began with Tun Razak, okay? But people didn't begin to see the opportunities. You think, for example, Tun Razak took over the plantation companies, among other things. But what was important was the fact that these plantation companies were nationally owned, and so the priority changed. It was no longer sending back as much dividends as possible to London, but rather it was how do we make even more. So you have the beginning of refining of palm oil, for example. And within a decade, these engineers who were not taken seriously were able to create the most efficient palm oil refining capacities and capabilities in the world. Now, that was achieved more than 3 decades ago, but we have not built on that to have many other achievements. Of course, you have, you know, the rubber gloves factory, which I think was developed in a suboptimal way, and of course you have pewter, you know, with tin products and so on and so forth. And if you have a few other achievements, but fundamentally we have not been able to sustain industrialization, partly because we have privileged foreign investors, and rather than develop the capacity of a national industrial community, including the engineers who are so important to serious industrialization. So we privilege, for example, financial engineers much more than real engineers, you know, and this unfortunately has created very perverse incentives in our society as a whole.
So it's very interesting because I can associate you with the generation of sort of policy ideas. And I think that what underscores that is the idea that the nation state and the governments that run it have the capacity to shape their own destinies. I mean, something that was a promise of independence, right? But to what extent are nations like Malaysia, small to middling sized nation, though we're a big trading nation, things come through us, are we constrained by our location in the global economic order? I mean, how free are we to imagine ourselves, you know, much richer, much more affluent, with great jobs and so on and so forth, in an economy, global economy that we can't control?
Earlier you referred to Rebecca Carl, and she said, no investigation, no right to speak. Okay? You begin with facts. You don't begin with preconceived ideas. And this is a big problem which we have. We often begin with preconceived ideas. We frame the very questions which we ask in terms of preconceived ideas, usually received from abroad, usually received from the so-called fonts of knowledge, Oxbridge, Harvard, etc., etc. There is no serious effort to begin with you know, just generally speaking, it's not a problem which is particularly Malaysian, to begin with the evidence, to begin with understanding and grappling with the evidence and moving on. So we have this problem of a lot of ideas being often derivative. We are essentially neo-colonial. We are captive minds, as Hussein Alatas said more than half a century ago. And this is a big challenge. It's a big challenge. How do we begin to struggle to overcome that? Because we are also, you know, victims of our own lenses and the way we, you know, when Ben Anderson talks about imagined communities, he presumes that the imagined community is the nation. But it's not necessarily the nation. It could be the ethnic. It could be, you know, something else. And this is, I think, the big challenge there. How do we forge and address the multiple problems which we face as a society going forward?
Because one of the really interesting things is that Jomo is an economist. That's his profession, right? But the other stakeholders in it are, well, politicians who also think themselves the font of all new ideas and seem to come up with them at a far too regular pace. The other thing is us, the public, right? And we also have fragments floating in our heads about how the world works. I mean, you told me there's a wonderful walk we had down Beach Road, and we were pointing out buildings, and you were talking about the 2 banks, and you said that people used to think that that bank over to our left was the more reliable bank because of the edifice, the architecture created trust and confidence, whereas this other one, which I think is still quite grand, but in a more modernist and, you know, sleeker way, was less trustworthy because of that. I mean, there are popular notions that perhaps politicians are much more keen to tap on than the advice of individuals like yourself. But how do we negotiate it? Because their legitimacy is based on popular notions, and to what extent are Malaysians, not those who kind of read stuff that's coming out of Harvard, but Malaysians who read stuff in their media or listen to their politicians describe and narrativize the economy. How do we negotiate that? I mean, I know education, so we always talk about education as a way of raising the bar, but is this an intractable problem? I mean,
that's a major challenge. Okay, we talked earlier about premature deindustrialization, and we wrote about this two decades ago, right after the Asian financial crisis and its impact on this country. But what what I think now, Harvard professors write about the same problem. And so there's a younger generation people who cite the Harvard professors. And so the question for us is a complex one. Do we submerge our egos, our personal egos about our ideas and so on and so forth, and then start citing these Harvard professors? Because Harvard professors, if you're thinking about salesmanship, you can sell an idea by a Harvard-endorsed idea much, much more. I remember years ago, when I first was studying abroad, I came back and people said, Yale, what is that? I said, the ones which make locks, And people got very upset with me because I was making a mockery of labeling. But now you have to reconcile yourself to that. So you say, oh yeah, this Harvard professor or this Oxbridge professor says this or that or the other, and then you legitimize the idea. But then you also have to say, this work has been done in Malaysia, which shows this problem. And that, so, often, unfortunately, the contestation of ideas often involves a lot of salesmanship.